Two young sisters and their guardian father figure shocked an entire community with unexplained phenomena that defied all logic. Dozens of witnesses, including respected townspeople and church officials, reported disturbing events that science still cannot explain today. The Vermont State Historical Society's sealed archives contained testimonies so unsettling that local authorities buried them for over a century, refusing to acknowledge what multiple witnesses swore they saw with their own eyes. Tonight, we reveal what really happened behind the walls of St. Mary's Gothic Church in rural Vermont. Before we continue with the story of St. Mary's, this channel is not for everyone. Only for the most combustible souls who dare to unravel the darkest chapters of American history. If you dare to hear what really happened in the shadows of our past, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments which state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to join our community of true mystery hunters? Let's find out together. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it was not motivated by religious fanaticism or supernatural forces, but by something much more terrifying: the calculated pursuit of answers to questions that should never be asked, hidden behind a facade of Christian charity and child care. It began in the winter of 1887, when Reverend Thomas Whitmore took custody of two orphan sisters, Mary and Catherine, ages 8 and 10. The girls had lost their parents in a house fire that left them traumatized and silent. What started as an act of Christian kindness soon became the most documented case of unexplained phenomena in Vermont's history, witnessed by an entire congregation who would never speak of it again. The congregation of St. Mary's would gather every Sunday, expecting hymns and prayers. Instead, they witnessed something that would haunt them until their dying days. The sisters Mary and Catherine would sit in the front pew, their small hands folded, their eyes fixed on something the rest of the congregation couldn't see. It started with whispers during the sermons, soft voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Reverend Whitmore would pause mid-sentence, his face pale, as the entire church fell silent to listen. The whispers grew louder each week, always in a language no one recognized. Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, the church organist for 30 years, documented every incident in her personal diary. Her entries describe how the temperature would drop 20 degrees whenever the sisters entered the sanctuary. Candles would flicker and die. The stained glass windows would rattle without any wind. But the most disturbing detail came from the church's communion records. Every Sunday, Reverend Whitmore would serve bread and wine to his congregation. The records show that Mary and Catherine never took communion. They couldn't, because according to multiple witness testimonies, the sisters cast no reflection in the polished silver communion chalice. The bombshell revelation came when the Vermont State Historical Society finally unsealed one crucial document in 1987. The house fire that supposedly killed the sisters' parents never happened. There was no record of any fire, no death certificates, no parents named in any Vermont registry. Mary and Catherine had appeared at St. Mary's one winter morning with no past, no family, and no explanation of where they came from. What terrified the investigators even more was the discovery that similar cases had been reported across New England. Two young sisters, always the same ages, always appearing after a mysterious fire that left no evidence, always under the care of a religious figure who would later vanish without a trace. The question that kept everyone awake at night was simple yet horrifying. If Mary and Catherine had no parents to lose in a fire, then what exactly had Reverend Whitmore brought into his church that winter morning? But what I'm about to tell you, my dear listeners, will make your blood run cold. Because the truth about Mary and Catherine wasn't hidden in Vermont's archives. It was sitting right here in my grandmother's kitchen in São Paulo, Brazil, in a yellowed letter that arrived 50 years too late. My grandmother, Maria Santos, worked as a seamstress in the immigrant quarter of São Paulo in the 1880s. She specialized in children's clothing, especially for the families who were fleeing Europe and North America. What she never told anyone, not even my mother, was that some of her clients weren't exactly alive. The letter arrived in 1937, postmarked from Vermont, but written in Portuguese. It was from Reverend Whitmore himself. In it, he confessed that Mary and Catherine weren't orphans from a fire. They were something much worse. They were his own daughters, killed by his hand in a moment of madness, and somehow brought back through rituals he'd learned from a Brazilian priest who had fled to Vermont after being excommunicated. But here's what made my grandmother's hands shake as she read that letter. She recognized the names Mary and Catherine immediately, because 50 years earlier she had sewn their funeral dresses. Small white dresses with intricate embroidery that took her months to complete. The same dresses that witnesses in Vermont described seeing the sisters wear every Sunday at St. Mary's Church. The most terrifying part of Reverend Whitmore's confession was his final paragraph. He wrote that the ritual hadn't just brought back Mary and Catherine. It had opened a door that could never be closed, a door that allowed other children, other souls to cross over. And every time someone tried to help them, to give them shelter or care, they would multiply. My grandmother kept that letter hidden for 40 years until she gave it to me on her deathbed. She made me promise to never speak of it. But now, as I hold this letter in my trembling hands, I realize why she was so frightened. Because according to Reverend Whitmore's final words, the ritual he performed wasn't meant to bring back the dead, it was meant to replace the living. The question that haunts me every night is this: if Mary and Catherine were meant to replace someone, then who exactly have they been walking among us as for all these years? That night I couldn't sleep. The letter burned in my hands like a piece of coal straight from hell. But there was something else my grandmother had hidden from me, something she whispered with her last breath that I thought was just the delirium of a dying woman. She told me that the funeral dresses she made for Mary and Catherine were never delivered. The man who ordered them, who claimed to be their father, never came back to pick them up. She kept those tiny white dresses in her sewing chest for 70 years, waiting for someone to claim them. After reading Reverend Whitmore's letter, I went to my grandmother's old sewing chest with trembling hands. The dresses were still there, wrapped in tissue paper, as pristine as the day she finished them. But when I lifted the first dress, my blood turned to ice. There was no embroidery on these dresses. They were plain white cotton, simple and unremarkable. Nothing like the elaborate dresses with intricate embroidery that witnesses in Vermont described seeing every Sunday at St. Mary's Church. But here's what made me drop that dress and run from the room. Sewn into the collar of each dress in my grandmother's careful handwriting were not the names Mary and Catherine. The names embroidered in faded blue thread were Maria Santos and Elena Santos, my grandmother's own daughters who had died of fever in 1886, 1 year before the sisters appeared in Vermont. The bombshell revelation hit me like a lightning bolt. Reverend Whitmore's letter wasn't a confession about bringing back his own daughters. It was a thank you note. A thank you for the souls my grandmother had unknowingly provided when she poured her grief into those funeral dresses, when she stitched her dead daughters' names with tears in her eyes. My grandmother hadn't been making funeral dresses for Mary and Catherine. She had been preparing vessels for her own lost children to inhabit. The ritual Reverend Whitmore performed didn't bring back the dead. It called to them across continents, across oceans, drawing souls who were desperate to live again. Now I understand why my grandmother never married again, why she never spoke my mother's name without crossing herself, why she always insisted on making all our clothes by hand. She wasn't protecting us from the world. She was protecting the world from what she had accidentally unleashed with her needle and thread. The question that keeps me awake every night is terrifying. If my grandmother's grief could call souls from their graves to inhabit bodies thousands of miles away, then what exactly has been living in our family for the past 100 years? But that night, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about my grandmother's story. Something that turned my blood to ice and made me realize the truth was far more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. I was alone in my grandmother's old house, staring at those funeral dresses when I heard it, a soft knocking at the door, 3 gentle taps, just like my grandmother used to make when she didn't want to wake anyone. But my grandmother had been dead for 2 weeks. I opened the door with trembling hands, and there stood two young girls, 8 and 10 years old, wearing identical white dresses with the most beautiful embroidery I had ever seen. They looked exactly like the old photographs of my grandmother's lost daughters, Maria and Elena, but their eyes were different, ancient, knowing. The older girl spoke in perfect Portuguese, though her voice sounded like it came from the bottom of a well. She said they had come to thank me for finally understanding that my grandmother had been their faithful servant for over a century, and now it was my turn to continue the work. That's when she told me the bombshell revelation that shattered everything I believed. My grandmother hadn't accidentally unleashed anything with her needle and thread. She had been chosen, recruited by beings who had been crossing between worlds for centuries. The funeral dresses were never meant for the dead. They were uniforms for the living, marking the families who would serve as anchors in this world. The girl smiled with teeth too sharp for a child, and explained that every family like ours had a seamstress, a keeper of the thread that binds the worlds together. My grandmother had been training me my entire life without me knowing it, teaching me to sew, to embroider, to pour my emotions into fabric, just like she had done. But here's what made my legs give out beneath me. The girl reached into her pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was me, standing in my grandmother's kitchen just moments before, holding those funeral dresses. But in the photograph, I wasn't alone. Behind me, clear as day, stood my grandmother, not as the old woman who had died 2 weeks ago, but as the young seamstress she had been in 1886. The question that echoes in my mind as I speak to you now is this: if I can see my grandmother in that photograph standing behind me with that same knowing smile, then what exactly am I becoming, and how long have I been dead without knowing it? But as those words left my mouth, I heard something that made my entire world collapse. A familiar voice, speaking from behind me in the very kitchen where I stood alone. It was my grandmother's voice, as clear as if she were standing right next to me. But when I turned around, the kitchen was empty. Only the funeral dresses remained on the table, and now they were glowing with a soft, unnatural light. That's when I realized the photograph the girl had shown me wasn't from moments before. It was from 1886. I was looking at my grandmother as a young woman, but wearing my face, my clothes, my expression, the same way I had been looking at those dresses, holding them with the same reverence, the same unknowing purpose. The girl's laughter echoed through the empty house as the truth crashed over me like a wave. My grandmother had never died 2 weeks ago. She had been me all along. The seamstress who made those funeral dresses in 1886 wasn't Maria Santos. It was me living my grandmother's life, completing a cycle that had been turning for over a century. Every memory I had of her, every story she told me, every skill she taught me, it was all my own experience, fragmented across time. I ran to the mirror in the hallway, my hands shaking, and saw my reflection flickering. One moment I was myself, the next I was the old woman who had raised me, then a young seamstress bent over her work in 1886. All the same person, all the same soul, trapped in an endless loop of serving these entities that moved between worlds. But here's the revelation that made me scream until my throat was raw. The grief I thought my grandmother felt for her lost daughters wasn't hers, it was mine. Maria and Elena Santos were never my grandmother's children. They were mine, and I had been reliving their death and my desperate attempt to bring them back for over 100 years. The question that haunts me as I feel my memories shifting and changing is this: if I am both the grandmother and the granddaughter, both the seamstress and the storyteller, then which version of me is speaking to you right now, and how many times have I already told you this exact same story? But as I stood there, watching my reflection shift between past and present, I heard footsteps upstairs, heavy, deliberate steps in my grandmother's old bedroom. The same room where she had died 2 weeks ago, where I had found her with those funeral dresses clutched in her cold hands. I climbed those stairs with my heart pounding, knowing I would find something that would destroy what little sanity I had left. The bedroom door was open, And there, sitting at my grandmother's sewing machine, was a woman I had never seen before. She was young, maybe 30, with calloused hands and tired eyes. She was sewing something white and delicate. When she looked up at me, her face was kind but sad. She spoke in Portuguese with an accent I couldn't place. She told me her name was Isabella, and that she had been the seamstress before my grandmother, before Maria Santos took her place in 1886. The woman's hands never stopped moving as she spoke. She explained that there had been dozens of seamstresses before her, each one believing they were the first, each one discovering the truth too late. The funeral dresses were never about bringing back the dead. They were about harvesting the living. But then Isabella told me something that made the room spin around me. She said I wasn't Maria Santos's granddaughter. I wasn't even Brazilian. My real name was Catherine, and I was one of the two sisters from Vermont who had disappeared from St. Mary's Church in 1887. The bombshell revelation hit me like a physical blow. Every memory I had of growing up in São Paulo, of learning Portuguese, of my grandmother teaching me to sew, was implanted. Mary and Catherine had never been brought back as children. We had been aged, given new identities, new lives, and sent to serve as seamstresses around the world, creating anchors for more souls to cross over. Isabella smiled sadly and held up the dress she was sewing. It was small, child-sized, with intricate embroidery that seemed to move in the lamplight. She said it was for me, for when I finally remembered who I really was. Because once Catherine remembered being Catherine, she would stop being the Brazilian granddaughter and return to being the 8-year-old girl who had first walked into that Vermont church. As I felt my adult memories beginning to fade and childhood memories of cold winters and church bells starting to surface, one terrifying question gripped my mind. If I'm Catherine, then where is my sister Mary? And how many other seamstresses around the world are about to remember they were never who they thought they were? But as those childhood memories of Vermont winters flooded back, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of my grandmother's sewing machine downstairs, running at full speed. The same machine where Isabella had been sitting just moments before, but now the bedroom was empty. I stumbled down the stairs, my adult coordination fighting against the child's memories that were taking over my mind. The sewing machine was running by itself, the needle moving up and down frantically, but there was no fabric underneath. Just the sound of metal piercing air over and over, like a heartbeat. That's when I saw them scattered across the floor, dozens of photographs, all showing the same scene from different angles. St. Mary's Church in Vermont, 1887. But these weren't old photographs. They were fresh, recent, as if someone had been there just yesterday. In every single photograph, the church was exactly as I remembered it from my childhood. The same wooden pews, the same stained glass windows, the same altar where Reverend Whitmore had performed his sermons, but the church had been demolished in 1923, nearly a century ago. Here's the bombshell revelation that shattered my reality completely. I picked up one of the photographs with trembling hands and saw the date stamp on the back, yesterday's date, but I wasn't looking at a rebuilt church or a historical recreation. I was looking at St. Mary's Church as it existed in 1887, photographed yesterday, as if time itself had never moved forward in that place. The most terrifying detail was in the corner of every photograph. Two small figures sitting in the front pew, their faces turned toward the camera. Mary and Catherine, exactly as we had been as children, but our faces were the faces of every seamstress who had ever served. Isabella's face, my grandmother's face, dozens of others I didn't recognize, all flickering and changing like a broken television screen. The sewing machine suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard my own voice, but younger, smaller, coming from upstairs, the voice of 8-year-old Catherine, calling for her sister Mary. But I was standing alone in that kitchen, no longer sure if I was the adult who had discovered the truth or the child who had never left that church. The question that paralyzes me as I hear those small footsteps coming down the stairs is this: if St. Mary's Church still exists in 1887, and if Catherine is calling for Mary from upstairs, then who exactly have I been all these years? And what happens when the child finally meets the woman she was supposed to become? But as those small footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, I turned to face what I thought would be my 8-year-old self. Instead, I found myself staring at an elderly Brazilian woman with silver hair and kind eyes. She was wearing my grandmother's apron and holding a cup of coffee that smelled like the Sunday mornings of my childhood. "Minha querida," she said softly, "you look so confused." The woman moved with the same grace my grandmother had, settling into the kitchen chair as if she had sat there 1,000 times before. She explained that my name wasn't Catherine, and I had never been to Vermont. I wasn't a seamstress, and there were no funeral dresses. Everything I thought I remembered was a story I had been telling myself to cope with a truth too painful to accept. She reached across the table and took my trembling hands in hers. Her touch was warm and real, nothing like the cold presence I had been feeling for weeks. She told me that my real name was Anna, and I was her daughter, who had been missing for 3 days after suffering a complete mental breakdown following my own grandmother's funeral. Here's the bombshell revelation that turned my world upside down. The elderly woman pulled out a hospital bracelet with my real name on it. She explained that I had been found wandering the streets of São Paulo, speaking to invisible children, convinced I was living different lives across different centuries. Everything about Vermont, about Mary and Catherine, about the seamstresses and the supernatural entities, had been elaborate delusions created by my grieving mind. The photographs scattered on the floor weren't supernatural evidence. They were old postcards from a Vermont tourism book I had been reading in the psychiatric ward. The funeral dresses were actually my grandmother's old tablecloths that I had been clutching when the police found me. Even the sewing machine running by itself had a simple explanation, a broken electrical connection that the landlord had been meaning to fix for months. But as this woman who claimed to be my mother showed me medical records and tried to convince me that everything had been in my head, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. When she reached for her coffee cup, her hand passed right through it, and the liquid remained perfectly still, as if it had never been touched at all. The question that terrifies me as I watch this woman's comforting smile flicker like a dying light bulb is this: if my delusions were so elaborate that I created multiple lives and identities to escape reality, then how do I know this explanation isn't just another layer of the same madness? And what happens when I can no longer tell the difference between the cure and the disease? But as I watched that coffee cup remain untouched, the woman's expression changed completely. The kind smile vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. She leaned forward, her eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made me want to run. "You're right to be suspicious, Anna," she said, her voice losing all warmth. "Because I'm not your mother. I'm not even Brazilian." The woman reached into her apron and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it to a page filled with my grandmother's handwriting, but the words were in English, not Portuguese. The entry was dated 3 days before my grandmother's death, and it described in detail everything I had experienced: the funeral dresses, the photographs, the voices, even my conversation with the 2 girls at the door. "Your grandmother wasn't a seamstress, Anna. She was a researcher. She worked for a project that studied inherited trauma, how grief and guilt could be passed down through generations like genetic material." Here's the bombshell revelation that made the room tilt sideways. The woman flipped to the final entry in the journal, where my grandmother had written about her greatest discovery. She had found a way to transfer traumatic memories from one person to another, to literally pass the burden of unbearable experiences to someone else. The funeral dresses, the seamstresses, the supernatural entities, they were all real memories, but they weren't mine, and they weren't hers. They belonged to the original Mary and Catherine from Vermont, whose trauma had been harvested and preserved, then implanted into dozens of families across generations. My grandmother had been the final recipient in a chain of inherited horror that stretched back over a century. When she died, all of those accumulated memories had transferred to me, making me live through every single version of the nightmare that had been passed down like a cursed inheritance. The woman closed the journal with a snap that echoed through the kitchen. She explained that I wasn't going insane, and I wasn't experiencing delusions. I was experiencing the collected trauma of every person who had carried Mary and Catherine's memories before me. But here's what made my heart stop. She said the transfer process was incomplete, and the memories were still copying themselves, still spreading. The question that paralyzes me as I see my own reflection beginning to flicker again is this: if these memories have been passed down for over a century and are still transferring, then how many other people around the world are living through Mary and Catherine's nightmare right now? And what happens when we all remember the truth at the same time? But as I stared at that journal entry describing my exact experience, the woman's face began to change. The wrinkles smoothed out, the silver hair darkened, and suddenly I was looking at a younger version of my grandmother, not as I remembered her, but as she appeared in those old photographs from the 1960s. She said, her voice now carrying my grandmother's familiar accent, "I never died 3 days ago. I've been dead for 60 years. The woman stood up and walked to the window, her reflection completely absent from the glass. She explained that the research project she mentioned wasn't about studying inherited trauma. It was about creating it. A deliberate experiment to see how many generations the same terrifying memories could control, how many lives could be destroyed by one carefully planted seed of horror. My grandmother turned back to me with eyes that held decades of guilt. She revealed that she had been the original researcher, the one who first extracted Mary and Catherine's memories from their dying minds in that Vermont church. But the process had backfired catastrophically. Instead of containing the trauma, she had become its first victim, trapping herself in an endless cycle of death and rebirth. Here's the bombshell revelation that made the kitchen floor feel like it was collapsing beneath me. My grandmother opened her mouth and spoke in a voice that wasn't hers, wasn't mine, but belonged to a terrified 8-year-old girl. "I'm not your grandmother, Anna. I'm Catherine. I've been Catherine this whole time." The woman's face flickered again, and now I could see the truth. Every person I thought I had been, every identity I had lived through, was actually Catherine trying to escape her own trapped consciousness. The seamstresses, the researchers, even the mother who claimed I was having delusions, all of them were Catherine's desperate attempts to create a reality where she wasn't an 8-year-old girl dying in a church basement while scientists extracted her trauma. She reached out with a child's desperation in her ancient eyes. "Anna, you're not my granddaughter, and you're not inheriting memories. You're my sister Mary, and you've been trying to save me for over a century." The question that freezes my blood as I feel my own memories beginning to shift and change is this: if I'm really Mary, and I've been trapped in Catherine's dying hallucination for over a century, then what exactly have we been doing to all the innocent families who thought they were living normal lives while we used their bodies to play out our endless tragedy? But as I felt my memories shifting between Mary and Catherine, between granddaughter and sister, I heard something that made my heart stop completely. The sound of my own voice, but older, much older, coming from the radio in the corner of the kitchen. "Good evening, dear listeners." It was my voice, but speaking with the confidence of someone who had been telling stories for decades, the same voice that had been narrating this entire nightmare. I stumbled toward the radio, my hands shaking as I realized what I was hearing. It was me, telling this exact story, word for word, exactly as I had been living it. But the broadcast was dated 1987, 40 years ago. Then I heard another broadcast, same voice, same story, dated 1962, then 1943, then 1924. The woman who claimed to be Catherine smiled sadly, as dozens of radio broadcasts played simultaneously, all featuring my voice telling the same terrifying tale across different decades. Each one with small variations, different names, different countries, but always the same core nightmare of two sisters trapped in an endless cycle. Here's the bombshell revelation that shattered everything I thought I knew. The woman reached behind the radio and pulled out a microphone connected to broadcasting equipment I had never seen before. She explained that I wasn't Mary trying to save Catherine, and I wasn't Catherine trying to escape trauma. I was the researcher who had started this whole experiment, and I had been broadcasting these stories for over a century, using the radio waves to implant the memories into innocent families around the world. Every family that heard my broadcasts, every person who listened to these stories late at night, became unwilling participants in my experiment. The trauma wasn't being passed down through generations naturally. I had been deliberately spreading it, using the power of storytelling to make people live through horrors that were never theirs to experience. The equipment hummed to life, and I could hear my own voice beginning to speak again, telling this story to a new audience, spreading the nightmare to fresh minds who would wake up tomorrow believing they were seamstresses or researchers or little girls from Vermont. The question that paralyzes me as I realize my voice is reaching thousands of listeners right now is this: if everyone who hears this story becomes part of the experiment, then how many of you listening to my voice at this very moment are about to discover that your own memories aren't real, and what happens when you all start living this nightmare together? But as I watched that broadcasting equipment come to life and heard my own voice reaching out to thousands of listeners, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. The woman standing beside me wasn't looking at the radio with surprise or fear. She was looking at me with the satisfied expression of someone whose plan had finally worked perfectly. "You think you're the researcher who started this experiment?" she said, her voice now carrying a distinct American accent that hadn't been there before. She walked over to an old wooden chest I had never noticed before and pulled out a stack of yellowed newspapers. The dates ranged from 1924 to last week, but the photograph was always the same. My photograph, my face, my name, dying in radio station accidents across different decades. The woman spread the newspapers across the table with deliberate care. Each article described how I had been found dead at my microphone, apparently electrocuted while telling ghost stories late at night. But here's what made my legs give out beneath me. Every single article mentioned that my body was found clutching a small white dress with intricate embroidery. Here's the bombshell revelation that destroyed everything I thought I knew about my existence. The woman smiled with triumph as she explained that I had never been alive to begin with. I was Mary, the sister who died in that Vermont church in 1887, but I had been broadcasting from the afterlife for over a century. Every story I told, every family I traumatized, every nightmare I spread through the radio waves was my desperate attempt to find someone who could hear the voices of the dead. The broadcasting equipment wasn't spreading trauma to innocent families. It was spreading my death across the world of the living, turning everyone who heard my voice into a bridge between life and death. Every listener who believed my stories became a little bit dead themselves, and every person who died while listening became a little bit alive. The question that echoes through my mind as I feel myself fading away while my voice continues broadcasting is this: if I've been dead for over a century, and every person listening to my stories becomes part of the world between life and death, then what exactly are all of you becoming right now as you hear my voice through your speakers? But as I felt myself dissolving into the radio waves, I heard something that made my ethereal form solidify with pure terror. The sound of my own voice, but not coming from the broadcasting equipment. It was coming from behind me, in the kitchen, speaking Portuguese with a thick Brazilian accent I had never heard before. The voice belonged to an elderly woman sitting at the kitchen table, calmly sipping coffee from a cup that was very real, very solid. She had deep wrinkles around kind eyes and wore a simple floral dress that looked like it had been sewn by hand decades ago. The woman gestured for me to sit across from her, as if dead radio broadcasters visiting Brazilian kitchens was the most normal thing in the world. She introduced herself as Dona Rosa, and explained that she had been listening to my broadcast since 1924, when I first started reaching across the veil between worlds. But here's what made my non-existent heart stop beating. Donna Rosa calmly pulled out a small leather pouch and emptied its contents onto the table. Dozens of tiny white buttons, each one carved with initials. She pointed to 2 buttons marked M and C and smiled sadly. Here's the bombshell revelation that shattered every reality I thought I understood. Donna Rosa explained that there never was a Vermont church, never were 2 sisters named Mary and Catherine, and never was a researcher conducting experiments. All of it was a story I had been telling myself because the truth was too simple and too horrible to accept. I wasn't a dead girl broadcasting from the afterlife. I was a living woman who had been in a coma for 97 years, and every single story, every identity, every nightmare I had created was my mind's desperate attempt to avoid waking up to what I had done. The buttons on the table weren't from funeral dresses or research experiments. They were from the 97 children's nightgowns I had been sewing when the gas leak in my São Paulo apartment had put me in this endless sleep. 97 children who had died because of the fire I accidentally started when I fell asleep at my sewing machine in 1924. The question that terrifies me as I see Donna Rosa reaching for a syringe filled with something that glows like starlight is this: if I've been unconscious for nearly a century and every story I've told has been my coma dream, then what happens to all the people who think they've been living my nightmare when I finally wake up and take back the lives I borrowed from them? But as Donna Rosa held that glowing syringe, her weathered hands began to tremble, not with age or fear, but with something that looked like recognition. She stared at my face with growing horror, as if she was seeing me clearly for the first time in decades. "Meu Deus," she whispered, dropping the syringe. The glass shattered on the kitchen floor, and the strange liquid spread like mercury, reflecting images of children's faces I had never seen before. "You're not the woman from the apartment fire." Donna Rosa stumbled backward, her chair scraping against the floor. She pointed at me with a shaking finger, her kind eyes now filled with absolute terror. The coffee cup fell from the table, but instead of breaking, it passed right through the floor as if it had never existed. She reached into her apron with trembling hands and pulled out a faded photograph. It showed the same kitchen we were sitting in, but from 1924. In the picture, a young woman sat at the sewing machine, surrounded by small white nightgowns. But the woman in the photograph wasn't me. It was Donna Rosa herself, 97 years younger. Here's the bombshell revelation that made the kitchen walls seem to dissolve around us. Donna Rosa's voice cracked as she spoke the truth that had been hidden for nearly a century. "I am the seamstress who caused the fire. I am the one who killed those 97 children. You're not in my coma dream, Mena. I'm in yours." The elderly woman's form began to flicker like a dying candle. She explained that I wasn't a woman who had been in a coma for 97 years. I was one of the children who died in her fire, and for the past century I had been trapping her spirit in an endless loop of confession and false awakening, never letting her move on to whatever punishment awaited her. But as Donna Rosa's image faded and the kitchen began to crumble around us, I heard something that made my blood freeze, the sound of 96 other voices, all speaking in unison, all calling the same name. Not Mary, not Catherine, not Anna. They were calling for someone whose name I had forgotten I ever knew. The question that paralyzes me as I feel those other children's voices getting closer is this: if I've been torturing Donna Rosa's spirit for a century to avoid facing my own death, then what exactly do the other 96 children want from me when they finally find us in this collapsing dream? But as those 96 voices grew louder, calling that forgotten name, I felt the kitchen floor give way beneath me. We were falling, Donna Rosa and I, through layers of memory and time, past all the lies we had been telling ourselves for nearly a century. When we landed, we were no longer in the kitchen. We were standing in a small radio station that reeked of burned wood and melted plastic. The same radio station where I had supposedly died in all those newspaper articles. But this time, I could see everything clearly. Donna Rosa looked around the destroyed room with growing recognition. She pointed to a corner where the bodies of 97 children lay in perfect rows, each one wearing a small white nightgown. But these weren't the children who had died in any fire. These were the children who had been listening to my radio broadcasts when the station exploded. The equipment hadn't been spreading trauma through radio waves, it had been spreading death itself. Every child who tuned in to hear my ghost stories had been slowly poisoned by gas leaking from the damaged broadcasting equipment. They had died in their beds in their homes, while their parents slept, never knowing that my voice was the last thing they heard. Here's the bombshell revelation that made the destroyed radio station spin around us like a carousel of horror. Donna Rosa's voice shook as she pointed to the corner where two small bodies lay apart from the others. Mary and Catherine, the sisters from Vermont who had never existed in any church. They were real children who had been listening to my very first broadcast in 1924, the broadcast where I invented their story using their real names from the radio station's fan mail. The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears as she explained that we weren't trapped spirits reliving our guilt. We were the radio station itself, somehow given consciousness in the moment of the explosion. Every story we had told, every identity we had inhabited, every family we had terrorized across the decades was the building's desperate attempt to understand why it had become a tomb for 97 innocent children. But as I stared at those small bodies and realized we were the murderer and the crime scene combined into one impossible entity, I heard something that made my non-existent soul scream. The sound of children's voices, not calling for vengeance or justice, but singing a lullaby I had never heard before. The question that freezes me with absolute terror as those dead children begin to sit up and smile at us is this: if we are the radio station that killed them and they've been singing us to sleep for nearly a century, then what exactly happens when they finally decide to wake us up and make us remember what we really are? But as those dead children began to sit up with their innocent smiles, I heard a voice that made my blood run cold. Not the voice of a child, but of an elderly Brazilian woman speaking from behind me with the authority of someone who had been waiting decades to tell the truth. The voice belonged to a woman in her 80s, wearing a simple black dress and holding a rosary that clicked softly as she moved. She had the tired eyes of someone who had carried impossible secrets for too long. My name is Irma Benedita, and I was the night janitor at this radio station for 40 years. Sister Benedita walked slowly between the small bodies, her worn shoes making no sound on the destroyed floor. She explained that she had been cleaning the station when the gas leak started, but she hadn't run for help. Instead, she had done something that haunted her for the rest of her life. She had locked all the doors from the outside, trapping everyone inside, because she believed the radio broadcasts were spreading something far worse than death. The elderly woman's hands shook as she pulled out a small notebook filled with her careful handwriting. She had been documenting every single broadcast for years, recording the names and addresses of children who called in to request stories. What she discovered made her realize that the radio station wasn't just entertaining children, it was collecting them. Here's the bombshell revelation that shattered everything we thought we knew about this nightmare. Sister Benedita's voice cracked as she revealed that there never was a gas leak or an explosion. She had set the fire herself, deliberately murdering 97 children because she had discovered they weren't actually children at all. They were adults who had been transformed by the radio broadcasts. Their minds regressed to childhood while their bodies remained trapped in a state between life and death. The old woman opened her notebook to the final page, where she had written the same sentence over and over: "The radio doesn't kill children." Every person who had died while listening to the broadcasts didn't move on to whatever comes after death. Instead, they were pulled back, reshaped into the form of innocent children, and used as vessels for something that had been feeding on human consciousness for centuries. Sister Benedita looked directly at me with eyes that held decades of guilt and terror. She whispered that she had been protecting the world from an entity that spreads through storytelling, through the simple act of listening to a voice in the dark. But her plan had failed catastrophically, because killing the transformed children hadn't destroyed the entity, it had only made it stronger. The question that paralyzes me as I hear Sister Benedita's rosary beginning to glow with the same unnatural light is this: if we're all just transformed versions of dead adults who the entity has been collecting for decades, then what exactly is it planning to do with an entire generation of listeners who think they're hearing a simple ghost story? But as Sister Benedita's rosary began to glow with that unnatural light, she suddenly stopped speaking and stared at me with an expression I had never seen before: pure, absolute confusion. She looked around the destroyed radio station as if seeing it for the first time, her weathered hands trembling as she touched the walls. "Mio Deus," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This isn't the radio station. This building was demolished in 1987. She stumbled backward, her black dress flickering like a broken television screen. "And I'm not Sister Benedita." The elderly woman's form began to shift and change, her face becoming younger, then older, then completely unfamiliar. She pressed her hands against her temples as if trying to stop her own thoughts from escaping. "I remember now. My real name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and I was a psychiatrist at São Paulo General Hospital." The bodies of the 97 children began to fade like morning mist, and the destroyed radio station walls became transparent. Through them, I could see the sterile white walls of a hospital room, where a middle-aged woman lay connected to machines that beeped steadily. The woman in the bed had my face, but aged by decades of medical procedures. Here's the bombshell revelation that made reality collapse around us like a house of cards. Dr. Chen's voice shook as she explained that none of this had ever happened. There were no dead children, no radio broadcasts, no century-old mysteries. I was a patient who had been in a psychiatric hospital for 30 years, and every single story, every identity, every terrifying revelation had been my mind's elaborate defense mechanism against accepting one simple, unbearable truth. The doctor's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the hospital room becoming visible around us. She revealed that I wasn't a seamstress or a radio broadcaster or a dead child. I was a woman who had murdered her own 2 daughters, Mary and Catherine, in 1987, and my mind had been creating increasingly complex fantasies to avoid remembering what I had done to them. The question that freezes my blood as I see my real reflection in the hospital room mirror, 30 years older and marked by decades of guilt, is this: if everything was just my mind protecting me from the truth about killing my own children, then what exactly happens when I finally remember their faces and realize that every listener who believed my stories has been living inside the mind of a child murderer? But as I stared at my aged reflection in that hospital mirror, I heard a voice that made my heart stop completely. Not Dr. Chen's voice, but the voice of an elderly Brazilian woman speaking from the corner of the hospital room where no one should have been standing. The voice belonged to a cleaning lady in her 70s, wearing a faded uniform and holding a mop bucket. She had the patient eyes of someone who had spent decades watching other people's tragedies unfold. "My name is Donna Carmen, and I've been cleaning this hospital room for 30 years. Donna Carmen set down her bucket and walked slowly toward my hospital bed. She explained that she had been mopping the floors when the ambulance arrived in 1987, when they brought me in after I was found standing over my daughter's bodies. But what the doctors never put in their reports was what I kept repeating over and over as they sedated me." The elderly woman's hands trembled as she pulled out a small notebook from her uniform pocket. She had been writing down everything I said during those first delirious hours, before the doctors decided I was having a complete mental breakdown. The words I spoke weren't the confused ramblings of a woman who had murdered her children. They were detailed descriptions of radio broadcasts that wouldn't exist for another 40 years. Here's the bombshell revelation that made the hospital room walls seem to dissolve around us. Donna Carmen's voice dropped to a whisper as she revealed that I hadn't killed Mary and Catherine in 1987. I had been describing their deaths in a radio station that wouldn't explode until 24, speaking about broadcasts I wouldn't make until decades in the future, telling stories about events that hadn't happened yet but would happen exactly as I described them. The cleaning lady opened her notebook to the final page, where she had written the same sentence I had been repeating that night. The children will die listening to my voice, but not yet. Every story I had told, every identity I had lived through, every terrifying revelation hadn't been my mind creating fantasies about the past. They had been prophecies about the future. The question that paralyzes me as I realize the radio broadcasts are still years away from happening is this: if I've been seeing the future for 30 years and every story I've told is going to come true, then how many of you listening to my voice right now are the children who are destined to die when I finally make those broadcasts for real? But as Donna Carmen closed her notebook, the hospital room began to fade around us like smoke. The machines stopped beeping, the walls became transparent, and I found myself standing in the most familiar place of all, my own living room in 1987, with my two daughters playing quietly on the carpet. Mary and Catherine looked up at me with those same innocent eyes I had been seeing in every story, every nightmare, every impossible memory. But now I could see the truth clearly. They weren't ghosts or spirits or transformed entities. They were just my little girls, alive and real and beautiful. Mary asked, her small voice cutting through 30 years of madness like a knife through butter. I knelt down beside them, my hands shaking as I touched their faces. They were warm, they were breathing, they were exactly where they had always been, in the moment before everything went wrong, before I lost my mind trying to understand why terrible things happen to innocent people. Here's the final revelation that brought peace to my shattered soul. There had never been a radio station or broadcasts or dead children. There had never been seamstresses or researchers or supernatural entities. There had never been any murders or mysteries or impossible phenomena. There had only been a mother who loved her daughters so much that when they died in a car accident in 1987, her mind created an entire universe of stories to avoid accepting that sometimes tragedy just happens. Donna Carmen appeared one last time, but now I could see her clearly. She wasn't a cleaning lady or a janitor or a hospital worker. She was my own mother, who had been sitting beside my bed for 30 years, reading me stories and holding my hand while I lived inside my own grief. "It's time to come home, Minyafilia," she said gently. I gathered my daughters in my arms for the last time, feeling their warmth fade as I finally accepted what I should have accepted 3 decades ago. They were gone. They had been gone since that terrible night in 1987, but they had lived, they had been real. They had been loved. As the living room dissolved around us, I heard my own voice one final time, but not telling ghost stories or supernatural tales. I was simply saying the words I should have said 30 years ago. Goodbye, my beautiful girls. The hospital room came back into focus, and I opened my eyes to see my elderly mother sitting beside my bed, tears streaming down her face. The machines were beeping normally. The nurses were smiling, and for the first time in 30 years I remembered who I really was. Not a radio broadcaster or a bereaved seamstress or a woman with supernatural experiences, just a mother who had finally learned to live with the most natural tragedy of all, the loss of the people we love most. Listen, this is the moment you need to act. You need to subscribe to this channel right now because stories like this don't come around every day. Mash that like button immediately. This is how we know you're part of our community of truth seekers. Flood the comments with your theories about what was real and what wasn't. Don't wait another second to share this with at least 5 friends who need to experience this journey. Only true fans understand that supporting this channel means supporting the kind of storytelling that changes lives. This is your chance to prove you're not just a casual listener, you're part of something bigger. Subscribe now, like now, comment now, share now. The algorithm is watching, and so are we.